President Trump, unfortunately, has frequently been most influenced by the last person who spoke to him. And he's far too emotional. Showing him pictures of dead children or something like that has a profound impact. That's one of the ways that we got involved in Syria with the various missile strikes. The rationale for them was entirely illicit and bogus. But nevertheless, he reacted in such a way. What's interesting to me is that he reacts in this fashion to what is clearly staged in Ukraine. The Ukrainians have become masters, with a lot of help from the West, at staging atrocities, staging massacres, things that they actually executed themselves. Bucha being the best example. But apparently Gaza doesn't penetrate. The mass murder and expulsion of people from Gaza, now mass murder through starvation, something which the NKVD practiced for 2 decades, killing millions inside the old Soviet Union. That seems to be the practice now in Israel. That doesn't penetrate. That doesn't even make it into the mainstream media. And as a result, President Trump doesn't seem to be in the least moved by those facts. It's beyond me. It's just, frankly, the whole thing is amateur hour. There's nothing professional about anything happening in the White House or inside Washington these days.
So let's talk about some of the ramifications of this on the other half of this equation from the Russian side. So we had the phone call with Trump and Putin. We've had the multiple, I think 3 different visits from Steve Witkoff to Putin, and they're saying that they're close to a situation. You may recall it was now more than 2 weeks ago that Witkoff said, "I think we're really, really close to having an agreement that both we and the Russians agree to, and then we need to see if we can get Zelensky and Europe on board, etc." But then there's been some changes since that time. There was, in just the last few days, an agreement, and I don't know if this was exactly after or before this pastor went to Ukraine, but now all of a sudden we're given a $350 million support package for F-16 training and support, which obviously has nothing to do with in finding a negotiated settlement. There is it was a $50 million deal for other military aid. There was a new air defense missiles from Patriots that have been now offered in there. So all of this looks like we're increasing our aid. Now, if you're on the Russian side of this and you've been talking to the White House and the administration on coming to a negotiated settlement that understands the core causes of this, as the Russians put it, if Trump started off by saying, "Hey, I understand that NATO was a big issue. That's one of the reasons they went to war, etc." But now all of a sudden you see this. Are we closer or further away from having an agreement?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that President Trump understands the implications of such an aid package. I don't know how much he knows about it. I mean, obviously, the people in Washington that are tied to the defense industries are going to cheer this on, because this means money once again for the American defense establishment, defense industrial establishment. But it effectively spoils any opportunity that we have to normalize our relations with Russia. And I thought normalizing relations with Moscow was something that President Trump wanted to achieve. It's in the interest of everyone for us to have normalized relations with the Russians. So again, this is all very disappointing. But if you're a Russian watching this, if you're President Putin, you sort of shake your head, but this is not really a surprise, because remember, just a few weeks ago, President Putin warned the leaders of Russia's economy and industrial capacity that he didn't expect anything positive from the West. He didn't expect any sanctions to be lifted. He didn't seem to think that the people that are in charge are ultimately in charge. In other words, that whatever we see as a government is a facade behind which there are other more powerful forces. And I don't know what you call those, donors, billionaire oligarchs, whatever, that are actually making the decisions. And this just tends to confirm his suspicion. And his point to the people in his country who are involved in the private sector was very straightforward. We have to become increasingly self-reliant, and we have to turn our attention to other markets in Asia, beyond the United States, to the global South. because the United States and Europe are just not reliable partners anymore. And I think that's what he's concluding now.
You know, there's this thought out there that moves like this, like the air defense missiles, the F-16, et cetera, and Zelensky is the biggest cheerleader of this, and it's echoed by many in Europe, is that we just got to put more pressure on Russia. That's the big problem. Trump hadn't been putting enough pressure on, because that'll bring Putin to his knees. I want to show you a video that was released in Russia. It was actually released this morning, but it was on the 30th, where Putin was talking to actually a group of children in Russia, but he's explaining to them the core of who Russia is and how much they're willing to sacrifice.
When I said that this is a holiday for practically every one of our families, it is only natural because with such enormous losses, 27 million people for the entire Soviet Union, the exact number still not fully counted, it is clear that nearly every family was affected. And it is extremely important to use modern opportunities to convey this information, this truth about the past, in this case, about the Great Patriotic War and its heroes, to pass it on to both today and tomorrow. Only by understanding the price at which our today and our tomorrow were secured, only by grasping the cost and the deeds of our ancestors, our fathers, grandfathers, even great-grandfathers, grandmothers, in defending the motherland, only by realizing the sacrifice it entailed, can we comprehend who we are, where we came from, and what our country truly is.
See that? I mean, he's saying something that other experts I've talked to said that's not just for show, that's what he actually believes. And certainly the historical record is black and white, that the Russians have suffered egregiously in the past, and yet they don't take their eye off of their objectives when they feel it's an existential threat. So do you think that issues like these with this F-16 deal, air defense, and these other kind of things are going to pressure Putin into changing his objectives?
Oh, obviously not. When I was in Moscow in 2001, in the NKVD archives, those are the archives of the secret police, were still open, I was told by members of the General Staff College that briefed us that they had counted 39,900,000 dead and were still counting. So I think the numbers are far worse than what President Putin mentioned. And in fact, to his credit, he said they were still counting. It's a tragedy on a scale that we cannot even begin to imagine. But throughout Russian history, certainly going back to the 10th century, when you have this Russian state that forms around initially what we call the Kievan Rus and the principalities that spring from all of that, the Russians have always fought to retain their freedom of action. In other words, to ensure that they were not blackmailed, that they were not actively suppressed or harmed. And remember, they went through Mongol invasions and Mongol occupations that lasted for 3 centuries. I don't think most Americans can even begin to imagine what that was like, nor should they at this point. But my basic point is that President Putin is not going to allow Russia to be bullied into a corner. And that's why Russia has built bridges, not only to China, but to the global south, to nations in the Middle East, in the Near East, the Indian subcontinent, Latin America. All of these bridges are for a reason, as an alternative to dependence upon, and particularly to avoid the bullying of the West. That's what he's about. He doesn't want Russia to be dependent upon us. He doesn't want Russia to be bullied by us. And unfortunately, this latest decision to send more military aid to Ukraine just reinforces the wisdom of his strategy to date. So there's no chance, no possibility whatsoever of Russia breaking under the pressure of sanctions or this other nonsense. What is far more serious, in my judgment, will be the readiness of the Russians to respond very, very violently towards us in the future, in other places, and particularly, I think, in the Middle East and about Iran.
You know, one thing, Doug, I think we have to admit is that as strong as the administration, I mean, it was everywhere from Trump himself, Rubio, the Vice President Vance, a couple of almost 3 weeks ago, where they really started saying this is Biden's war. We just want it to end. We could be walking within days. We had Tammy Bruce last week say that we are no longer going to be the mediators, and we're rapidly approaching the point where we're not going to do anything else, et cetera, to now all of a sudden backtracking here. And I'm going to show you something in just a second that he also said in that same interview on Sunday. Frankly, it's looking a lot like that Zelensky has been more effective at getting Trump to come over to his side than for Trump to lay down the law and tell him, here's how it's going to be. The latest point is, here's what Trump said regarding sanctions yesterday.
Your close ally, Senator Lindsey Graham, has a sanctions bill against Russia. If you get to that point, Mr. President, where you're prepared to walk away, will you sign that sanctions bill?
Well, it depends on whether or not Russia is behaving toward coming to a peace. We want a peace deal. We want Russia and Ukraine to agree to a deal.
Mm-hmm. So you think you're close to a deal? What will Russia have to give up? Because Ukraine, there's been discussions they will have to give up some of the land.
Russia will have to give up all of Ukraine. Because that's what they want.
All of Ukraine, meaning they wouldn't keep any of the land that they've claimed?
Russia would have to give up all of Ukraine, because what Russia wants is all of Ukraine. And if I didn't get involved, they would be fighting right now for all of Ukraine. Russia doesn't want the strip that they have now. Russia wants all of Ukraine. And if it weren't me, they would keep going. You know,
the kindest thing I can think of is to say that the man is deluded. And he's placing himself and our country on a path to war with a state that's not our enemy. Now, that is gratifying to someone like Lindsey Graham, who watches his re-election campaign and private accounts fill up with money because he's an advocate for war in the Middle East against Iran and the whole world on behalf of Israel. And he's an advocate for war with Russia come what may. But that's not in the interest of the American people. The American people haven't signed up for body bags and a busted budget, financial Armageddon. The Americans want peace and prosperity. They want peace abroad and prosperity at home. He doesn't seem to understand that. We all thought that he did, which is why large numbers of us voted for him. But he appears to be extremely confused. And frankly, he's lost the bubble. So I can't expect anything to happen now. Russia is certainly not going to suddenly say, oh, please, President Trump, you're a great man, and we want to be your friend. We'll do whatever you say. That's nonsense. We've got to get out of this. He's still stuck in 1990. You know, remember, Washington is really Versailles on the Potomac. But as I look at Versailles in 1789, frankly speaking, whatever their problems, they were more in touch with reality than Washington, D.C. is.